Kenya is now, according to Transparency International, the 159th most corrupt country in the world, out of a total of 175 that they analyze. 159 out of 175. You are almost the most corrupt country in the world. Congratulations. And yet, you are also one of the most Christian countries in the world. 80% of you call yourselves Christians. 10,000 students every year pour out of your Christian unions into the workforce. So I'm asking myself, how is this possible? How can this be true? And the Kenya I know and love, which goes back to 1965 when I first visited here, and where my mother was born and brought up and lived most of her life, over 2/3 of her life in this country. The country I know and love was never like this before. In 1960s, it was the Pearl of Africa. Everyone spoke about its fantastic governance. So how has it gone from where it was to where it is? And where is the solution now? Where is the solution now? And I believe it lies profoundly in the churches, and I want to share with you how I see this situation. So I think Kenya has a cancer. And the cancer is eating away at the bones. Or you might think of it as some ivy that is growing up a tree and strangling the growth of the tree so that it is now dying. And I think part of this lies in the institutions. Now, institutions are not organizations, they are the rules that govern the way that public life is organized. And the thing that I learned in Kenya, when I was in the churches in Kenya, the thing I learned was what I never learned in the West, what I never learned in Britain or when I was doing my PhD in America, is that Christianity impacts on public life, not just private life. It is about public life. God is concerned with public life, not just with private life. So take the ownership of land. Land influences the way people relate. And you have imported from the West a pattern of individual ownership of land, which goes against both your own traditions in Kenya, I believe, but also it goes against the biblical teaching on land in Leviticus chapter 25. There is an issue about whether individuals should have the right on their own in rural areas to buy and sell land. This is allowed in Leviticus on the basis of city-owned land, but not on the basis of rural land. Or take the issue of debt. The Bible speaks from one end to the other against debt, because debt is toxic for families, toxic for human relationships. It creates a balance of power in a relationship which the Bible regards as unhealthy. So whether you look at Exodus or Leviticus or Deuteronomy, whether you look in the Psalms or Ezekiel, whether you look in the teaching of Jesus and the parable of the talents, whether you look in Romans 13, wherever you look through the Bible, the teaching is always against debt. No debt. And if you get into debt, every 7th year, that debt should be cancelled. And the first 1,500 years of the Christian church, the church allowed no debt. Somehow, interest and debt has crept into the church's life through somebody I hugely admire for their theology, John Calvin, who seemed to open the door just a little tiny bit. I think the Roman Catholic Church allowed interest from about 1854. But look at the history of the church on the issue of debt. And now think about debt in Kenya, national debt. You are a deeply, deeply indebted country. And I have to say that I don't think all the money that has come in from those foreign loans has actually reached their proper destination. That's the truth of the matter. But it isn't just national debt, it's corporate debt and personal debt, housing debt. There are other ways to finance houses without debt finance, through shared equity and so on. And also, we have companies that have been run for too long in the interest of shareholders, who are often absentee shareholders. They don't have any contact with the company. And yet a significant part of the profits is returned to those shareholders, and the company is run in the interest of the shareholders. Now, I must take off my hat. I must acknowledge the extraordinary work of Professor Mervyn King, who will, I hope, speak to you later this afternoon. He is tireless in the way he goes around the world, trying to teach an alternative understanding of companies and of corporate governance. He's been recently in Australia. He's about to go to Namibia. Then he's going to get an honorary PhD in Melbourne, back in Australia. Then he's on to Tokyo. He's all the time on airplanes. Why? Because he's so dedicated and committed to spread the message that companies are not just about shareholders. There are many other stakeholders as well. And Mervyn, I want to compliment you today for your message this morning, for the way you've given your life and your own freedom to pursue justice in this area of life. Thank you for what you do. But I hope you'll also forgive me if I raise a question in your current deep constitutional crisis as to whether you've really adopted a Western understanding of constitution and government around social contract and individual voting as being what it's all about. So you end up with a winner-takes-all constitution, which is now causing you such deep problems and distress and could even split the country. I'm sorry to say it, but the covenant concept of constitution, which was the basis on which the American colonies originally came together, where you make a covenant before God as a set of communities who promise to stay together, like in a marriage covenant, in a constitutional covenant. That whole covenantal concept of constitution should be, I believe, at the heart of your Kenyan life and constitution, and because it's been based on a Western model which actually doesn't fit easily in the African context, you are in deep problems. And my deep prayer, is that you will not break up this country in this process, but that a solution will be found which will keep people together. But it's also a problem of the heart. And that goes back to, as I've mentioned this morning, for those who were there, the problem partly of schools, that the schooling system is based on competitive individualism. It's how can I beat you? How can my results be better than your results? So you compete all the way through school, and then people leave school and they compete in the office. They compete in life for more money, for more power, for more position compared to their neighbors. Because the whole spirit of cooperation and relationship was not taught in the school system. And in the churches, I fear again the missionaries, and I count myself as someone who came to this country with this very mindset, that salvation is about my individual personal relationship with God. And of course, that's true. It is. That is how I understand it. It is our relationship with God which is the foundation of our salvation. That is absolutely true. But it is so much more than that. The missionaries came and said, you are guilty. You, individually, you have sin. Yes, yes. You can be forgiven through Christ. Yes. And you can then go to heaven. Yes. I tick all the boxes, but Christianity is much more than that. Now, there are people in this room much more theologically educated than me. I would call myself a humble economist, if that was not an oxymoron, if that was not impossible. How can any economist be humble after all? But let me just remind you, great theologians in the room here, let me remind you that God is not a God by himself in eternity. Maybe the Muslims think of Allah like that, but we Christians do not think like that. There was Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And Genesis 1:27 says, as you all know, let us make human beings in our image. Male and female created he them. There are men and women, that's the most fundamental human relationship. But it's about the relationship with God as well. Sin is a breakdown of relationship between God and humanity, and between men and women, and between many other neighbor relations. Righteousness means right relationships. Covenant is about a long-term, stable, committed relationship made before God. Jesus was the perfect relational person, and he redefined poverty as primarily not a shortage of money, but a shortage of relationship. It was Zacchaeus he went to see on the way to the cross, a wealthy man, but relationally a very poor man. The cross, the heart of our faith, is about reconciliation and forgiveness. This is relationship language. And the church is meant to be a relational community, not with superficial relationships, not about networking, but about making deep, challenging, accountable relationships with one another inside the church. And eternity is described by Jesus as a great banquet. We will have a banquet here later this evening, but the eternal banquet will be even better than a Hezebika banquet. But a banquet is about community. It's about conversation. It's about celebration, yes, but it's deeper than just that. It's about community and conversation. It's not me by myself on a cloud strumming a harp. This is the new creation, where we have jobs to do, but it's about us being together with Christ in glory. So how can Kenya be changed by the church? Let me give you a few thoughts. We need to see the church, I believe, examining the biblical teaching on debt and campaigning against debt. We need to say to the government, we want a debt-free growth strategy. We don't want any more of these big foreign loans. We want to develop without debt to other countries, which will be repaid by our children and our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren. It's unfair on the younger generation to take on that debt. We want land ownership outside the cities to be within the context of the community, within the context of the ethnic group even, where land cannot be bought and sold on an individualistic basis. We want schools that are based on a relational ethos, where people are examined, children are examined, not just for their technical skills, their knowledge of math, science, and language, but for their relational skills, where they learn those relational skills in schools. And we want time to come under public scrutiny. Time is our scarcest resource. Not money, but time. And that's what Sundays is all about. It's by preserving our time for God and for our families. And yet work invades our time, shopping invades our time. We as Christians make other people work for our convenience. So these shop workers are dragged into work because we as Christians cannot be bothered to organize ourselves enough not to need to shop on a Sunday. Of course there are sometimes emergencies. Of course there are sometimes we have to travel and buy petrol. I know those things, but just as a community of Christians, don't we need to go back to that Sunday principle that has been at the heart of the faith since its beginning? Now, when I look at some of the great issues of the past, you find that the people who tackled them were Christians backed by the church. So take Wilberforce, his great campaign against slavery. You dig into that. Not every person who backed Wilberforce was a Christian, but let me tell you, it was the churches who were the heart of that campaign against slavery. That is what the history books show, if you look into it more carefully. And churches also were behind the big reforms of Shaftesbury, where he limited working hours in factories for children. You might think they were still far too many, but they were working 14 hours a day from the age of 7 or 8. It was a great Christian leader, Shaftesbury, who started to limit all of that kind of working of children. In my own time, I've been privileged to run a campaign in Britain called the Keep Sunday Special campaign. It was against Mrs. Thatcher when she was Prime Minister of Britain, and I think it was the only bill that she ever lost in Parliament. But it was because the churches decided this was wrong, that they wanted Sunday to remain a special day. They wanted a balance between work and rest. It was because they decided that in Britain that they campaigned against the British government. And the first interest group or coalition of interest groups in 100 years defeated a government bill. When churches get moving, the politicians have to watch out. because the churches can mobilize people, but it depends on the leadership of the churches recognizing that public responsibility. Now, there is a catch, and the catch is this, that we in the churches cannot point the finger at the politicians and say, no debt, and say, we need time for our families, and we want relationships to be taught in our schools, and we want relationships to govern the ownership and distribution and buying and selling of land. We want that relationship context to govern everything in our public life. We cannot point the finger when there are three fingers pointing back at us, and the politicians say, well, what about relationships in your churches? If you think relationships are so important, what are you doing in your churches to put them right? What kind of relationships do we have in our churches? And I think that is an enormous challenge. And let me just speak for a few moments on that before I finish. A friend of mine went to a church in Oxford, and he said that day they read Colossians 3:13, which says, be forbearing with one another and forgiving of one another. So forbearing means that you don't get irritated with somebody. And forgiving means that if they do you wrong, personally or as a group, you forgive them. And he said, I looked around this church. It was quite a large church by British standards, about 500 people. And he said to himself, he said, I think we must be a most wonderful church, because there's nobody in this church I find irritating, and there's nobody I haven't forgiven in this church. This man was a pastor. And then he said, I had a terrible thought. And the thought was this: there is nobody I know well enough in this church that I need to forgive them, or that I could find them irritating. In the church, we just say, hello, how are you? And if your partner, your first person sitting next to you says, in Britain, they say, well, I lost my job last week. You say quickly, well, it was raining a lot during the week. Let's talk about the weather. It's what we don't do in Britain, where we don't know what to talk about. We always talk about the weather, but we don't engage with that person's unemployment. We don't say, well, can I help you pay your electricity bill? We don't share our money in the churches. We share everything in Britain except money. Because money is for me, right? Not for us. So there's a huge challenge in big churches as to how you create deep relationships. When I joined the church which I'm a member of now, the pastor said to me, you cannot join this church, you cannot be a member of it unless you join a house group. Where you meet in the middle of the week with maybe 8 or 10 people. If you're not prepared to do that, you may not join this church. And I said to him, but I'm important, I'm busy, I have so many things to do, you don't understand my life. He said, I'm sorry, that's the deal. We only want people who are prepared to give time to building deep personal relationships in our church. Otherwise, you may not be a member. So now I'm leading one of these house groups. First I joined, now I'm stuck with leading it. Although I have to say, I think my wife does a lot of the hard work. And isn't that true in so many areas of life? And then a third issue I must mention just very quickly is the issue of forgiveness. I worked in Rwanda after the genocide. I remember there was a meeting of the Council of the Churches, which we had convened in Kigali after the genocide. And I remember the leader of this council standing up to speak after the genocide, and he spoke powerfully against the Hutu. He ranted against the Hutu people for half an hour. And I spoke to the Anglican bishop over coffee. I said, how can the leader of the churches in Kigali speak with such bitterness against this other tribe in Kigali? And he looked at me and he said, this bishop said so wisely, he said, if your wife and 4 children had all been murdered by the Hutu, what would you be saying here today? How do you forgive people who have really wronged you? And yet Jesus makes it a condition of our faith that we forgive people who've wronged us. There's no other condition given in Jesus' teaching on the forgiveness and acceptance by God except this one. God will not forgive you if you do not forgive people who've wronged you. Now, those people may be within your own family. I confess in my own family, somebody close to me had said something against my children, and for 10 years I did not forgive them for that. Do we forgive? Do we forgive other ethnic groups that we think have wronged us? In Britain, do we forgive immigrants? In Britain, we don't have a problem of ethnic groups, but what we do have is a problem of class. Our British problem is class, which you don't have in the same way here in Africa. But we have white middle-class churches, blue-collar churches, but it's very hard to find integrated churches. But the issue is forgiveness that I want to focus on. Think through your relatives. That's always the hardest place to forgive. Think through other ethnic groups. Think through other people who are neighbors or in your community. Think of people who've wronged you. And ask God to help you to forgive. It's very difficult to forgive one-off. It happens over a period of time. But in our churches, if there's no forgiveness among our church communities, we will never change the nation of Kenya. We won't. So my last point was to let you think about the issue of love. Love God and love your neighbor. On these two laws hangs the law and the prophets. And my great moment in Kenya of eureka, of understanding, of breakthrough in my thinking, came when I was meditating on that verse. Love God and love your neighbor. On these two laws hangs all the law and the prophets. And thinking to myself, I'm going down to the World Bank office in Dar es Salaam on Monday morning, and we're talking about compulsory villagization. What am I going to say to the guys? That the solution on compulsory villagization is love. If I said that, they'd think maybe I'd gone a little bit soft in the head. Maybe I was in flower power from California in the 1960s or something. But you see, all of public policy in the end is about relationships. It permeates everything. It permeates corporate governance. It governs the relationships in companies. It governs what happens in schools, in the criminal justice system, everywhere. Jesus said, "They will know you to be my disciples if you love one another." If love is about other person-centeredness. And Jesus also says, "As the Father has sent me, so I am sending you." How was Jesus sent by the Father? Well, he lived with his disciples day by day and night by night. He was with them. He was close to them. There was no power structure between Jesus and the disciples. He washed their feet. Discipleship is not about position. It's not about power. It's about love and humility and all the things that I find difficult and which we all, I think, find challenging. So the call for the church at this critical moment in Kenya's history is surely to stand up and be counted, to be part of Hezebika, to be the force that drives change in this country, that finds the solution to the constitutional crisis through prayer and through commitment of searching for solutions, seeking changes in the way companies operate, changing the way things work in schools, encouraging people to spend time with their families, with their children, to put time into their relationships in their families and in their church communities, to develop deep relationships in the churches where the relationship with your brothers and sisters in the church is as deep or even deeper, Jesus says, than the relationships in the family. So I commend this idea to you. I ask you to look at all the different websites you can find connected with the Jubilee Center in Cambridge. Sorry about the connection to Jubilee in Kenya, but there's no connection. Jubilee Center in Cambridge, Relational Schools, the Marriage Foundation, Relationships Foundation, ALIA, which is about job creation, Relational Thinking Network. And let us pray for one another. Please pray for me in the work I'm doing between North and South Korea. Let me pray for you. in the constitutional crisis, and that God will root out the corruption in this country. In the name of Jesus, amen.